Tommy, I may have gotten myself into a little bit of trouble again on First Take.
There we go.
Well, trouble to some, trouble not to me. I'm good. I sleep well at night. I sleep very well at night.
It takes a lot to throw you off. It does take a lot to throw you off.
Yeah. I mean, Dominique Wilkins made some comments that I didn't know what I was talking about, which is fine. Like, Bob Cousy has said something in response. Jerry West, of course, has said something. Like, none of that bothers me. Those guys, I more than respect their opinions because they're legends. They lived it. I don't have their experience. I don't get worked up about that. I've gotten worked up a little bit about the way things are framed, I think. So last week on First Take with Mad Dog, he said Larry Bird was a top 5 3-point shooter ever. And I misspoke and I said, he's not a top 3. And then I reframed it later in the segment and I said, he's not a top 5 3-point shooter ever, which he's not. But in the segment, I said, Larry Bird, top 10 player all time. That's undisputable. I actually have him higher than 10. One of the greatest shooters ever. Again, there wasn't an emphasis on 3 points back then. Larry Bird shot 37.6% for his career. Richard Jefferson, I think, shot a higher 3-point percentage for his career than Larry Bird. And Richard Jefferson is not a 3-point shooter. I chide him all the time about his shooting. Larry Bird shot 1.9 attempts per game for his career. Like, it's not, there's no volume, there's no efficiency. Like, there's no argument to be made that he's a top 5 3-point shooter ever. He's not. He's one of the greatest players ever. He's also one of the greatest shooters ever. Like, that, to me, is also an indisputable fact. It's not throwing shade to say somebody's not a top 5 3-point shooter. And the trope that every old talking head uses, Mad Dog, Stephen A, physicality, right? It's fine. My entire point about the segment was that outside of fouls, hard fouls, and fighting, the physicality, the basketball play by play, the physicality is not that much different than today's NBA. But it's become such a talking point that people take it as gospel. Anyone, myself included, can go watch games from the 90s, full games, not montages of people getting fouled hard, not montages of Jordan getting fouled by the Pistons.
You've watched a lot of full games. You've told Jason and I recently. You spent probably too much time watching full games recently.
Bro, enjoyably. I love basketball. I enjoy. This morning, we were delayed. I'm traveling. I'm in Phoenix right now to call the game tomorrow night. We were delayed, and I came across my YouTube feed, the full game of the 1976 finals, Boston versus Phoenix in Boston, game 5, one of the greatest games ever played. All right. Before we took off, I got through the first half. Like, I just enjoy watching basketball. And by watching basketball a lot, film through a critical lens that I did for 15 years as a player, 4 years at Duke, I can discern what is happening on the court. I don't need to look at a box score to tell me what is happening on the court. And the reality is, from my lens, from my eyes, when I watch older games, there's not a discernible difference between Michael Jordan in the post now versus Jokic in the post now. We can talk about the rules. We can talk about hand checking. We can talk about illegal defense. We can talk about defensive 3-second, zone defense, all that stuff. All factors into it.
I have a narrative question for you about this, because this happened with Jerry West when he gave his comments, and it happened with Dominique a couple of days ago. I think one of the issues, and maybe this is a media thing in general, it's not unique to basketball, it's not unique to sports. One of the issues is these guys are being asked questions that are disingenuous, where the information, your name is being used, and these things are being framed as you saying something that you are not saying. You've never made fun, you've never criticized Larry Bird in the slightest. We have a photo of Larry Bird hanging up in our studio. And
Larry Bird with the trucker hat on, sitting in a pickup truck.
Basically, Dominique is being
one of my favorite
asked,
players ever. Yep.
Yes, he's being asked to respond to a comment, a quote unquote comment that you made that you didn't make. So of course he's going to say that.
Right. So the comment, or whatever the question was, I watched the video, but whatever the comment or the question was to Dominique centered around this idea that I disrespected Larry Bird. How? Did disrespect Larry Bird? I questioned the narrative around physicality. I said, for every montage video you can show me of Larry Bird being in a headlock underneath the basket, I can show you a montage video of him shooting open jumpers, of him coming off pin downs. Yeah, I can show Steph the same way. I can show Steph getting held. I can show Larry getting held. It's like, it's all basketball. People think the 80s and 90s were like these prison rules. Were there physical games? Yeah, there were. There were fights. There were fouls. There was grabbing. There was holding. There's no fights anymore. Unless you're Mo Bamba and Austin Rivers, there's no fights anymore. There's marginally hard fouls. They've cleaned up all these flagrant rules. It's to protect the players. I get it. There's not a difference. The idea though that I'm like disrespecting older players for questioning media narratives around that era, that's not disrespect. That's not disrespect. What have I been consistent on since day one? Since day one. This all started with the top 75 list. It all started with that. Since day one, on that episode, which was, I believe, in November of 2021 or 2022. Yeah, November 2021. It was right after I retired. They came out with the top 75 list. And I questioned a couple of the selections because all the 50 greatest players from 1996 made that list. They all made it. And so that we were left with 25 years to pick 25 other players. And some of the players that didn't make the top 50 list in 1996 that were retired made that list. So a lot of modern players got held off that list. What I said then, what I've said 15 or 16 times since then on the podcast, on ESPN, players should be celebrated. We should congratulate greatness for that era. The greatest players of every era, whether that's Wilt, Jerry West, Larry Bird, they would be fine in any era. And one of the pushbacks on that comment is always today's players wouldn't be fine in the 80s and 90s, which is fucking horseshit.
Yeah.
So of course I'm going to push back on that narrative. That's what it comes down to. It is not a knock on, dude, Dominique Wilkins is fucking awesome. He was awesome. Larry Bird was awesome. Jerry West was awesome. Bob Cousy was awesome. Dolph Schayes with his two-hand set shot that shot 38%. Great. You were awesome in the 50s, bro. You were awesome. Congrats. No shade. No shade.
It is.
Whatsoever.
It is. It's just messed up that it's instigating. You know, it's like kids on a playground and it's like a game of telephone and you're causing someone else to have a fight and you're just like, I'm not dissing you.
But the other point I want to make is I don't actually enjoy comparing eras.
Yeah.
Like I got asked about it on First Take when LeBron broke the record. Who's the greatest player of all time? You know, and it's like, well, Jordan said it best. Gave an interview with Mike Wilbon in 2009. I can't say I'm the greatest player of all time. I didn't play against Wilt. I didn't play against Jerry West. I don't know. The better question is who's the greatest player of a generation? Who's the greatest player of an era? That's a better question. Every single time this has come up, I'm not the one bringing it up.
Yeah.
It's people making crazy comments. Bob Cousy is a top 5 point guard of all time. No, he's not. Objectively, no, he's not.
You
Larry Bird's a top 5 3-point shooter of all time. No, he's not. Objectively, he's not.
We don't talk about it on this podcast. We don't talk about it with us.
It's not something we do.
We don't talk about it with other players because other players don't want to talk about it either. It's not a fun conversation. When you play, it's not a fun conversation.
Bro, we had GP on the podcast, whatever that was, last June. And like hearing his stories from the 90s, like I enjoy it, man. It's a different era. We had Dr. J on the podcast, hearing his stories. It's a different era. I love hearing those stories. It's a different experience. Yeah. Basketball is basketball, man. Basketball is basketball. If you want to make it football, I don't know of an era where it was football. I do know there were certain teams at different points that played a more physical style of basketball. Guess what? Michael Jordan did not play the Detroit Pistons 82 times a year. Guess what? In the 90s, Michael Jordan did not play the New York Knicks 82 times a year. I don't know what else to say. I really don't. I will just say, I will say just like I said before, as a friend, for the people watching this, for the people listening to this, whatever it is, when these firestorms happen on Twitter, and it's not that important, but just go to the tape. Go to the tape and see what was said, and then watch the instigating happen. And it's like, don't fall for the okie doke. And I know it doesn't bother you, No.
Because you've been through this for a while, but it is annoying.
I'll tell you what bothers me. Because something does bother me. So Dominique Wilkins, Bob Cousy, Jerry West, that doesn't bother me at all. It does not bother me. I'm nothing but love and respect and admiration for every player that came before me, every player that came before this generation. Nothing there. What bothers me, and ESPN does it too, right? We have to do it a little bit on social when we condense our videos to 2 minutes, but we're not doing it for clickbait. You only can put up a certain amount of time. So if we're having a conversation and you see a 30-second video with a headline from whatever aggregate website, it's probably not the entire part of the conversation. So again, it goes back to this idea of disrespect. Fuck that. There's no disrespect. Flowers.
Good rant. I think we got 3 in a row. 3 weeks in a row with